steering box adjustment on your Mercedes that no one talks about. Time to get your canned sardines out because you're going to need some protein. When you have a Mercedes from, I don't know, 1985 and earlier, steering box play is an issue that everybody seems to have a major problem with. Unless you have some perfect ultra low mileage car, it almost seems like there's a little bit of play in the center of the box that can never quite be eliminated. So there's an adjustment that most of you work on your cars are familiar with, and that's this adjustment right here. This is the Pitman shaft, which is this thing that controls the steering arm. That's the adjustment for this thing. And when you unlock this 19mm nut at the top, brace it with a wrench, and back the stud out in the middle, the steering box may tighten up. But if you go too far in and the steering box drags and it starts to hunt, and you go down the highway and you're like, man, I can't control my car. I'm having to adjust a little to the left, a little to the right, a little more to the left, a little bit more to the right. And it becomes really difficult. Not much fun at all. But that adjustment on top of the box is not the whole story. There's another adjustment that nobody talks about, and there's some videos about it, and there's some threads about it on Benz World if you dig, but we're going to talk about the sector adjustment. And the sector adjustment is a slotted nut right at the middle of the input shaft. So to make this adjustment, the first thing you have to be aware of is how much input shaft play and how much pitman shaft play you have. And the way to figure out your actual input shaft play is to loosen the 19mm nut and run the stud almost all the way in. Run it in, let it have all the play you want. It's not going to hurt anything. You know those people that said, oh, you can't adjust this thing all the way. Once you go out, you could ever go back. Well, it turns out they were full of it. You could go in and out on your steering box adjustment as you please. All you're doing is making the two gears mesh a little bit tighter. But this adjustment doesn't control the actual gear. It controls the amount of pressure that the input shaft puts on what's called the spiral bearing race. This is the little thing that's shaped like a spiral staircase full of ball bearings that moves the gear in and out. It's like an internal gear drive. And on the outside is the gear that turns the pitman shaft. Is that confusing? Well, sure, but I'm going to simplify it. What you want to do is you want to adjust this guy so that you can turn it. I can't turn this one easily because I over adjusted it. But you want to be able to turn it easily by hand. So your box is to be able to turn easily by hand, including this thing, and not have too much dead play in the center. And if you take an old steering coupling, which has the splines on it, and turn it left and right, you can kind of feel the play. A little bit of play before it engages the gear. You're always going to have a little bit of play. The question is how much is too much. But here's the trick. If you make this too tight, the play becomes really obvious. And if you leave it too loose, the play also becomes really obvious. And when you tighten the nut, you could give the box more play than it actually has. And yes, there are some special tools you need for this, but we could sort of work through this problem together. So these become an issue on cars that have higher mileage, let's say over 150,000 miles, or cars where the mechanic who's working on the car really didn't understand what was going on. They took the big nut off here, which I think is a 62mm nut, and then they put a new seal and a new O-ring on the center nut and then just put it back in willy-nilly. And I've had to do a few of these adjustments recently on different cars because I was trying to figure out what a good method of operation is for adjusting this thing. And what I've learned is that if you can sort of kind of get like a wrench, like what's called a pin wrench, which is adjustable, Sometimes it's used to fix bicycles, but it's going to have little pins that you can use to adjust this thing, because once you unlock the 62 millimeter nut, the center nut actually turns relatively easily. The problem is when you cinch the 62 millimeter mega nut down, and again, guys, I'm wrong. If I'm wrong about that size, sorry, but I'm pretty sure it's 62. I could be wrong. Maybe it's 60. When you cinch it down, it will actually turn the center nut. So you have to go back and check your work every single time. If it had you should mark your nut and mark the body. That's the operating procedure I came up with. Hopefully you guys like it. Mark the nut, mark the body. Figure out what a good position for this nut is before you tighten the 62 millimeter nut. And then that way, if you index it, if you mark this nut and mark the body, if you index it properly, you could tell if one mark has deviated from the other when you've tightened the 62 millimeter nut down. Because this thing will turn, take the middle nut with it, it'll cinch them both down. Then your steering box becomes overly tight. We found that if you want to get it right, figure out what the best position for this is. Turn this one back about 10 degrees, then tighten the 62 millimeter nut, and this will bring the two marks into line with each other. So once you figure out a good position for this, I'm going to repeat myself. Dial the nut back about 10 degrees and then tighten the 62 millimeter nut. Now, how finicky is this adjustment? How precise is it? Because this adjustment is precise to about a quarter of a turn or a half a turn. This one is precise down to 1 or 2 degrees when you really get in the landing zone. That means 1 or 2 degrees can make the difference between you having a box that's overly stiff and hard to turn and makes your shoulders sore, or having a steering box that's really nice and easy to turn. And the golden standard here is that you should really be adjusting this thing and getting all the play out of this before you start fooling around with this. Now there's another trick too that I haven't shared with you yet. When you're making all these adjustments, you see this hole right here? This is the centering hole in the bottom of your box. There's a little divot in there. And that divot is designed for a centering pin. You don't want to put the centering pin in, but you want to be able to see the divot through the hole. That means your steering box is centered, and you need to make all your adjustments when the box is centered. If you don't, you're going to get a false amount of play because the box is designed to have a little bit more play as you deviate from center. Confusing? I hope not. Line up the divot with the hole. That means you're on center. And at that point, when you turn left or right, you should be able to turn this thing with your fingers. You know, not my fingers, with your fingers. It should be gentle enough to turn with your fingers, even after you adjust this. See, the trick with the Mercedes boxes isn't eliminating all of the play and over-tightening everything. The trick is sort of assimilating the looseness of the box into its ease of operation so that you don't detect the looseness because the box is so easy to operate. Unfortunately, it takes a couple of attempts to get good. A lot of this is intuition. So I realized that maybe 1 out of every 500 of my subscribers might have this ability. Maybe I'm being real optimistic, but you may have to spin. This is not a quick adjustment. You have to adjust these things, tighten them down, and then go back and walk away after your hands relax and come back and check it again. And again, you want the least amount of play here, the least amount of dead play, which you're going to be able to feel with your fingers before this thing starts to turn. Some people go, oh, this is easy. Not really, because if you come back 10 minutes later, you might feel play that you didn't detect before because your wrist was so bound up. So anyway, at least you know. This is something you could take to your mechanic, maybe if you have a good mechanic. Or this is good information that might tell you that your box can be improved. If you felt this was useful, please like, share, and subscribe. And, you know, why not give it a shot? Because this is still cheaper than putting a rebuilt box in your car. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video and you have a better idea of how your steering works in your classic Mercedes.